Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel, Columbia and Harvard, the exception or the rule. I'm Pamela Nadell, professor of history at American University, which is neither Harvard nor Columbia. And I'm joined by Professor Steven Pinker, Harvard University's Johnstone Professor of Psychology. Next to him is Harvard's Hillel director, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, who on October 7th was the Jewish chaplain at Yale. And next to him is Columbia University Professor Nicholas Lemann, formerly dean of its journalism school and co-chair of its anti-Semitism task force. Before I ask them to begin with their opening remarks, I want to set the context for our conversation. I feel a bit like the title of Susie Linfield's book, Walking into the Lion's Den. Some of you might recall, as we heard, as Jamie Kirchick reminded us this morning, that there was a viral hearing, congressional hearing with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. I was the fourth witness in that hearing, which you won't remember because nobody tried to fire me. But the word context got a particularly bad reputation after that hearing. However, we are sitting in the Center for Jewish History. It holds millions of archival documents. And the task of a historian, which is what I am, is to understand them within the context in which they were created. So I'm going to ask our panelists to make some opening remarks that will reflect on the context in which they find themselves at this particular moment. And it's a context that gives them a bird's eye view, or as Nick reminded me earlier, maybe a worm's eye view of what's going on their particular campuses. So they are going to discuss their position that gives them a particular perspective, so you understand where they're coming from. They're going to assess the nature and extent of anti-Semitism on their campuses from that bird's eye view. And they're going to talk about their thoughts on the university's responses to the problems and challenges their schools face. I've decided, as a historian, that our panelists should speak in chronological order. Since Harvard was founded in 1636, and Columbia not until 1754, Professor Pinker will start us off. He will be followed by Rabbi Rubenstein and then Professor Lemann.
Thank you. I am a professor of psychology at Harvard. I teach our large introductory course with anywhere from 100 to 350 students. So I spend a fair amount of time with our students. I'm also the co-founder and president of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, an organization we formed 2 years ago to promote intellectual freedom, viewpoint diversity, and civil discourse on campus. And needless to say, there were many reasons that Harvard needed such a council. Harvard has had a number of problems, including some high-profile cancellations. The last straw for us was when my associate Carol Hooven was effectively forced to leave after she said in a TV interview that there were two sexes. I thought that our council would mainly be dealing with problems with academic freedom, such as that one. Turns out that most of the items on our docket were whether pro-Palestinian protests crossed various lines and violated time, place, and manner restrictions. There undoubtedly are problems at Harvard, as our very recent report on anti-Semitism documents, almost very few of which are reminiscent of the problems that we heard of about this morning, the kind of genteel WASP country club, Oliver Barrett III, snobbish anti-Semitism. Almost all of them are spillovers of a phenomenon that goes well beyond Harvard, namely that in vast sectors of the left, vast sectors of the young, there is almost a sacred cause that Israel is a uniquely malevolent entity on the world stage and the Palestinians a uniquely victimized people, and that the top moral and political priority in the world is to draw attention to the situation of the Palestinians. And you all are familiar with some of the eruptions of anti-Israel activity, such as our 45-day encampment. On the other hand, I'm currently writing an article for the Times on what I call Harvard derangement syndrome. That because Harvard is so prominent, oldest, richest, most famous university, anything that happens at Harvard, and a lot can happen. We have 23,000 students in 12 schools on 3 campuses with 2,300 faculty. All it takes is for one incident to go viral and people think that it characterizes the entire university. And so we have accusations such as that Harvard is a woke madrasa, it is an Islamist outpost, it is a bastion of rampant Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, and these are truly deranged. Not to deny that the problems exist, but it really is none of those. I'll just speak from my own experience, having spent the last 49 years on and off again at Harvard, including the last 22 years. I've never experienced anti-Semitism, and the Jewish faculty that I've spoken to say the same thing, as do many of my students. Just a bit of reality check. 3 of our last 4 presidents who've served longer than a year have been Jewish. 3 of our last 3 provosts have been Jewish. 40% of our university professors are Jewish. 40% of our living Nobel Prize winners are Jewish. 40% of my department is Jewish, including 3 of the last 4 faculty members that we hired. The anti-Semitism report does document feelings of lack of belonging, of lack of security, of lack of safety among our students, particularly among the Israeli students. And I think that really is a distinct problem. But it has to be, I feel, pardon the expression, put into context. We're also dealing with a cohort that increasingly has signed on to a culture of victimhood, a historical change from a culture of dignity, where it used to be that to achieve status, one had to be able to brush off insults, to control one's emotions. The new growing culture, as a theory of Campbell and Manning, is that you achieve status by being a victim and you count on institutions to ratify your victimhood. That has to be taken into account in terms of the response to questionnaires among our students, including our Islamic students who say, and I quote, that the fact that Harvard has not divested from companies doing business in Israel leaves them feeling unsafe. So we got to take the word safety with a grain of salt across all our students. In a brilliant op-ed from a former president of Harvard, Jacob Miller, he noted that in a way we have accepted one of the main premises of the critical social justice movement, that there is only one evil in the world, and that is identity-based bigotry. And so what are, in fact, historically illiterate and sometimes monstrous arguments against Israel are being, rather than being refuted on their own terms, are being folded into anti-Semitism, as if that's the only reason that one could morally oppose anything. And Susie Linfield this morning made a similar point. And Jacob, by the way, began his op-ed by saying the claim that 25% of Harvard students feel unsafe is an absurd statistic, and I say this as someone who proudly wears a kippah and has been on campus for 4 years. The Harvard derangement syndrome has rather severe consequences. The fact that the Trump administration is using it as a pretext to defund science, possibly remove Harvard's tax-free status, forbid it from accepting foreign students. Among the implications are that all of our science students and science researchers, postdocs, research assistants, professors, are now in a state of horror that their careers are going up in smoke, their research projects are being canceled, ostensibly to advance Jewish interests. Now, among other things, this is not so good for the Jews. Having your career wiped out, having your research nullified is much worse than walking past a globalized the Intifada sign. And I can only imagine what is going on in the minds of the non-Jewish scientists who are seeing their careers nullified ostensibly to advance Jewish interests. This is something that we have to oppose quite vehemently. What can be done? As some of our panels this morning indicated, this is not a problem with a simple solution, but one thing that I think that would go a long way toward helping it is simply if we had principled, systematic leadership from the Harvard Corporation, the famously reclusive secret society that has not taken any responsibility for the various fiascos on campus of the last 2 years, and presidents and deans who could remind the public of what a university is for. The way universities are often run is, it seems to me that the press office and the general counsel are in charge, trying to get the university to stay out of the headlines and not offend the students. We saw how well that's worked out. Instead, university leaders should be prepared to stand on principle, to articulate reasons for policies, such as that the university has a mandate and the expertise to pursue and transmit knowledge, not to advance social justice. No one gave us that mandate. We have no particular expertise in it. That there are principles of free speech that do allow for the expression of obnoxious opinions, but that may not cross the line into coercion, intimidation, and disruption. That the university endowment is a fiduciary responsibility held in trust for future generations. It is not an op-ed page that different factions can try to commandeer. That the university commons belongs to a community with diverse opinions and may not be appropriated by one faction. These are all, and finally, that the principle of academic freedom is not a perquisite or privilege of professors. It's there for a reason, namely, humans are fallible. The only way that we can pursue knowledge is if some people can voice opinions, other people can point out what's wrong with them. Now, these are all principles. You can defend them. Sometimes they will result in consequences that will offend people. Too bad, because the advantage of a principle is you can defend them, you can articulate them. I don't think our university leaders have done that enough. If they did, then even when they made decisions that are unpopular, they can stand behind them, and in the long run, that would, I think, right the reputation of the universities and allow them to act on principle. One more thing, of course, is we already have rules on the books that their students and organizations may not discriminate on the basis of religion, national origin, or political ideology. They should be enforced. They're there for a good reason. Another example of a principle that I think would get the leadership out of a lot of trouble, that would solve a lot of the problems we're facing.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Rabbi Rubenstein.
I want to play to my rabbinic role here and against it. To it, I will tell a set of stories, reflect on them, and close with a kind of sermonic flourish. And against it, I'm going to suggest that anti-Semitism is certainly something we're seeing and not a very helpful analytic or prescriptive lens for what ought to be done. And I want to justify that. I want to first start with just a set of quick stories. I heard one from someone over coffee this morning that at SUNY Purchase, students are afraid to walk in the Hillel because if they are photographed entering the building, those photographs may cost them internships in the art world in the future. At USC 4 years ago, Rose Rich, the undergraduate vice president, resigned because of a really vitriolic, horrific harassment campaign against her based on her Zionism. At the Graduate School of Education at Harvard this past year, there was an Israeli student who had to stop coming to campus, even the library, because if his friends were seen talking to him, they would be excluded from group projects and WhatsApp chats. And I'll share the following pair of stories from Yale, which will be the central thing we're thinking about. I'm richer in Yale stories, but the thrust of this, and I'll show an image in a second to make this case, is that we're seeing a very broad phenomenon. If only it were at the universities, if only it were at Harvard, what Suzanne Nossel, who's here, encountered in the literary world, what we're seeing with therapists, for example, is very similar. The traditional rabbinic training, just to give you pictures, you counsel someone a few times, and then you counsel them out to therapy. Increasingly, my colleagues are reporting that people are coming back because their therapists will tell them they won't treat them because they're Zionists, and rabbis are looking for a different way to relate to their congregants. Right? Something is happening very, very broadly here in American society. It is happening also at universities, but not exclusively, and perhaps not even most prominently there. These are the two stories at Yale beyond the fact you should know that last year society taps were rescinded for some students over allegations of Zionism. Students said, I won't be in society with a Zionist, and it wasn't the student who said that, but the alleged Zionist whose entrance into the society was revoked. So these are the two stories that I think are paradigmatic. These both happened before October 7th. The first, a first-year student is working in a biology lab. She's being mentored by an older student. They're chatting while an experiment is running. The older student said, what classes are you taking? The younger student lists a few and says, and a language. The older student says, oh, I love languages, which one? The younger student says, modern Hebrew. The older student kind of recoils and refuses to make herself available for mentorship any longer. The second is in the spring of 2023, Houria Boutelja, who's a French politician and intellectual, was invited to speak by a professor in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program. And Boutelja has been a supporter of Hamas. She has said, who am I, who are we, to delineate between the legitimate and illegitimate methods of Palestinian resistance. We have to support it all. And this had cost her extensive support. I reached out to a former head of this program, who I'd known for a number of years, to express my concerns. And instead of talking this through, a meeting was called and involved the dean for, the vice provost for academic freedom, the head of the chaplains, the head of humanities, and me. And I was accused of something that shouldn't be an accusation in the first place, participating in a right-wing campaign to cancel this person's attendance. And I said, that's actually not why I'm here. I'm here because Matthew Eisenfeld, who was Lemann class of 93, was murdered by Hamas on a number 18 bus in Jerusalem in 1996. And I just want this professor, especially if she's inviting someone who supports Hamas, to stand up and say she doesn't want the Jewish kids to get killed when they're in Jerusalem this summer. And a professor who held significant student life responsibilities turned to me, looked me in the eye and said, Jason, sharing an increasingly diverse campus means sharing it with people to whom Hamas means many different things. And what those two stories, it's chilling, you never quite recover from a story like that, nor should you. But what those two stories share, the kind of more, I would say, innocuous, and then the more potentially deadly one of Hamas share, is there's a failure of roles clarification. And what I mean by that is if you're on the basketball team, you have to pass to the center when she's open, even if you don't like her politics on a Ukraine ceasefire. And if you're not willing or able to do that, you're off the team, like yesterday. There are plenty of other organizations you can be in that will advocate for this or that in Ukraine. The basketball team is not one of them. So too, at Yale or at Harvard or at SUNY Purchase or at USC or anywhere else, you have a job, a role in the university, which is the transmission, preservation, and expansion of knowledge. And that means listening sympathetically to the other kids in your seminar. It means grading your students fairly and mentoring them generously. It means following the facts wherever they lead, especially when they're inconvenient for your theories. And if you aren't interested in doing that, you ought not to be at the university. And the university risks its reputation by supporting you and giving you its a role there. And that, I think, is the heart of what we're seeing is a roles confusion. And now if we could put the graphic up, is this here? I just want to show this really quickly. Okay, great. So this is a chart. Many of you may have seen it from Washington Monthly. This is a scatter plot. On the x-axis, every dot is one of the private universities in America. The x-axis is the percent of students attending on Pell Grants. So the further you are to the left, the wealthier the student body is. The y-axis is the post-sticker price, tuition and fees. And the color of the dot indicates in the last academic year the type, if any, of anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian activism. Blue dots, no protest. Red dots, protest, no encampment, and green dots, encampment. And what you see, jumps off the page that the top left is green. Right, this is not a story about this provost made that decision, that admissions community. We're seeing something that's much broader and deeper. And in case you don't believe me, I've done so many statistical tests of significance in the last 25 years, Nate Silver approvingly retweeted this. And so I want to think for a minute about what this is, what we're seeing, and what we're encountering. Okay, the clock is working. I have 4 minutes left. I can do this. Here's a helpful contrast, and this is why I think the frame of anti-Semitism may not be the most useful. The contrast between the day after Jews were murdered in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and the day after Jews were murdered in the area surrounding Gaza was very stark. And the sense is that if you are a certain type of Jew, you are within the circle of grievability. And if you are another type of Jew, you are not. Put more sharply, if you are the type of Jew who is living in the diaspora, who has entrusted your safety to another country, and maybe another religious, political tradition, you are to be grieved. But if you are that type of stubborn Jew who has insisted on taking your safety into your own hands in Zionism, you are not welcome. You are excluded from the circle of grievability. And that idea that there is something anathema about Zionism has a long history, particularly on the left. To give you some examples, right, in 1924, as the Bolsheviks are cleaning up from the Russian Revolution, they require that every Jewish group denounce Zionism in order to maintain its licit status because, stop me if this sounds familiar, after the Balfour Declaration, all Zionists are ipso facto agents of Western imperialism. Right, in 1969, the Soviet ambassador, this is Jim Leffler's work in Rooted Cosmopolitan, the Soviet ambassador to the UN becomes the first human being to utter the word Zionism is racism, as a ploy not to attack Zionism, but to use the US's relationship with Israel as a cudgel against it in the broader world. And Paul Berman wrote an excellent article, which you should all read, that this is behind a similar cartoon at Harvard, which would have been comic were it not so grotesquely anti-Semitic. This cartoon was posted by a number of student and faculty groups, quickly retracted, but only partly. The cartoon, in case you haven't seen it, has a hand with a Star of David and a dollar sign in the middle. Descending from the two of the fingers, there are ropes that terminate in nooses, one around the neck of an African man, one around an Arab man, and there's a sword coming to cut them that says Third World Liberation. That was taken down and replaced by a picture of Stokely Carmichael, because the cartoon first ran in the SNCC magazine in 1967. And this is the point I mean, like, the students were running that not because they believed particularly about something, this river or that sea, but because they are loyal followers of Stokely Carmichael. To give you a picture, this is a student reported this to me, as she described it as the most disturbing conversation she's ever had in her life. She was somewhat sympathetic to the encampments. She actually had thought about leading Shabbat services in the encampment. And she thought she couldn't do that unless she could tell the other Jewish students she was close with that their concerns about the encampment were mistaken. She could wholeheartedly encourage them to join. She said, I can't do that given what's going on. So she approached the leaders of the encampment and said, can you kind of tone down the anti-Semitism? And the two of them said, one of whom had been in Cuba training for the revolution the previous summer. Two of them said, well, we understand that it's harmful to students and maybe even harmful to our cause when we shout globalize the Intifada. And she said, well, why do you keep doing it? And they said, well, we are loyal members of the global left. The left has chosen Palestine as its cause, encampments as its strategy, and these chants as its tactics. And we have had to sacrifice some of our autonomy as the price of loyalty. When you say they're chanting river and sea and don't know which river and which sea, it's like if I ask you if E equals MC squared and I say, does that apply to dark matter? And you're like, I don't know. That's what my physics teacher I trusted said, right? They're participants, loyal participants in a progressive place. I know I'm gonna go just a second over time here. What I want to point out is this is a basic failure of the liberal academic virtues of following truth. It's an illiberal progressivism here. And when in my conversation with Larry Summers, I said to him at one point, I said, Larry, asking some of these programs, ethnicity studies, ethnicity, race, and migration at Yale, to hire a scholar whose work is sympathetic to Zionism is like, from their perspective, asking the geology department to hire a flat earther. To which Larry shot back, there's a reason we have an astronomy department and not an astrology department. And what's so brilliant about that, right, is there are different disciplines and histories of knowledge that have their own rules, and we're a place like a Yale or a Harvard or even a USC or a SUNY Purchase. To incorporate one of those, it would be like a lead balloon to its reputation and its claim to stand at the vanguard of truth. And it's precisely the difference here that you can tell. We can talk about viewpoint diversity, we can talk about anti-Semitism. I think we can also talk a little bit upstream of that in the sense that the core virtue is to follow the facts, right? Physicists dream every day when they wake up that their inbox will have some findings from CERN that disprove the standard model. Whereas people in these programs do not wake up dreaming that someone will have a new finding that Israel's actually pretty good and revolutionize the field. And it's that kind of failing that I think sits at the heart of a lot of this in many places in society, but including places like Harvard. And I think it's that we'll talk more about this in the Q&A, that the university leadership has a responsibility to address, has a possibility of addressing, and has taken some important steps, but not all the ones that need to be taken.
Thank you. Professor Lemann.
Okay, so the reason I'm here, as Pamela said, is that I was appointed in late October, early November 2023 as one of 3 co-chairs of Columbia's Anti-Semitism Task Force. So that has been a very emotionally overwhelming and not particularly pleasant experience for me. I had been an active, involved faculty member, probably one of the most active in opposing BDS at Columbia since starting in 2005. And I kind of had the feeling that that was, you know, on the university model. It was, we would write letters and petitions, we would get signatures, the BDS people would, we'd say hello to each other when we passed each other on the campus, and that was fine. It hasn't been fine, and it hasn't been that way since October 7th at all. We were appointed on November 1st officially. On November 2nd was the first published objection to our legitimacy before we had even done anything. And it was just clear from really literally day one that serving on an effort to combat anti-Semitism at Columbia in certain circles was not okay. And that's, you know, a very powerful finding. Let me do some context that I think is important. So if you ask me, what is the biggest change? I'm a Harvard alum, a few years ago, have been an actively involved alum since then. If you ask me, what's the biggest change at Harvard since I was there, it would not be that it's been taken over by the left at all. First time I met Marty Peretz, an event that he recounts very briefly in his autobiography, you remember what I told you, but you may not remember what you told me, which is, what do you really think of Soul on Ice? That's just by way of saying, you know, it wasn't like Harvard was real centrist back then either. The biggest change at Harvard and Columbia is that the overwhelmingly biggest change, at least undergraduate, is the rise of computer science and economics to complete dominance of undergraduate life, to the point where, you know, 75% or 80% of the students are in these 2 fields. And that was, you know, some of us have a dear friend, Michael Kinsley, and he wrote a very funny article circa 70 or 71 about being an undergraduate economics major at Harvard and what a brand of shame it was in the atmosphere of the time. So this is the big story about these universities. That leads, I think, in part to what I call the purification theory. If you're in the humanities and the sort of softer social sciences, you're in a shrinking part of the greater whole, and you get fewer resources, fewer students, you're much less the central part of the university, and you feel beleaguered and sort of oppositional. I think that's part of it, but I think it's too much to say there's been this very recent and total takeover of far-left ideology at the university. There's also a paradox in these elite universities. I completely agree anecdotally with the chart you put up. My oldest child is a professor at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and we just talked this morning. We talk, you know, every Sunday, and I say, anything happening there? Nope. It's all quiet. So it really is particularized to not just elites, but a fairly small number of universities, with the elites mostly in the news. And we can speculate somewhat as to why, which I'll do in a second. At these universities, like I grew up blocks from the campus of Tulane University in New Orleans. One of the wonderful things as a consequence of what we're talking about is Tulane has figured out that its future is to be the most Jewish university in America, and has therefore pretty much saved my beleaguered hometown. But even when I was growing up, if you stop a Tulane student on the street and say, what do you think about what's going on in Ukraine, they're likely to say, how should I know? At elite universities, there's a culture that oddly combines very careful and specific expertise, and you know, you cannot be an amateur and exist in this world, with oddly having a sort of super moralistic hot take on various issues of the day that you don't know anything about. I can't quite explain where that mix comes from, but it's very palpable. And as Jason said, at the top of the charts right now is Zionism and Israel as the #1 morally unacceptable and evil thing in the world. And it just gets absorbed by people who couldn't pass a quiz about it, you know, but it's just something they believe. So our task force, the good news is we've done 2 reports. One was published in March of 24 on rules for protests. The second was the result of a bunch of listening sessions we held. That was published in around Labor Day of you know, the current academic year. We have 2 more reports coming very soon. One is an ambitious student survey, and one is about you know, what happens in classrooms. I think if you were to read these reports just in a vacuum and say, does this make sense? I think you'd probably say this makes sense. It seems pretty commonsensical to me. What are some interventions if the problem is defined as, you know, particularly things that affect students on campus? But each report has been unbelievably controversial and has occasioned 0.0 of the kind of comeback that you'd think, well, you know, I respect that you're acting out of good faith, but let me tell you where I disagree with you. It's just this kind of furious negative reaction. The last report we published, there was a big petition demanding that our task force be disbanded in the name of academic freedom and free speech. So, so that's been quite disturbing, and I'd say quite a number of my personal longstanding relationships, having been at Columbia 22 years, are pretty much over now just because I serve on this task force. And I don't know what to do about that exactly. I can sort of say what to do in specific policy terms, and maybe later we'll get into that. But again, I don't think it's that complicated. But what to do about this overall climate, not of the entire campus, but of a very distinct minority of the campus that has a kind of blowtorch-like attitude toward, quote, Zionism, that is very, very difficult. I do want to say a word that would go against some of what's been said here today about, I guess, the 2 terms that I think are useful for my work doing this are consistency, which came up in the last panel, and empathy. Most people that I talk to at Columbia at least profess to believe that there's no connection between Israel and being Jewish, that these are 2 completely unrelated topics, and that everything about Israel and Zionism was kind of inserted into the Jewish tradition by sort of weird outside forces very recently, and they're not connected. And so that enables them to say, I'm not anti-Semitic. You know, you can't be racist at a university. Anti-Semitism is understood as racism, although, you know, the term was popularized by a racist. That's a different story. And so, you know, I'm not anti-Semitic because if I were anti-Semitic, I'd say I hate Jews. And I don't hate Jews. I just hate Israel and Zionism. So then you enter the realm of, well, how come so many Jewish kids don't receive these, you know, super intense hatred of Israel and Zionism as not anti-Semitic? And then the person will often say, well, they're whiners and they should shut up and pull up their socks and just stop complaining. Or a variant of that, of just, I mean, I've had people look me in the eye and say, I just don't feel any empathy for them. Sorry, and I don't think I have to. So I'm concerned, and I ask all you to hear me out on this a little bit, that if you jettison the entire vocabulary of concern with how students receive things, not the intent of the speaker, if you get rid of all shreds of a sort of empathetic administration, be careful what you wish for, because it provides a platform for an utter dismissal of the kind of Jewish kids my kids are. And it really makes me upset.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the panelists the opportunity to respond, but I'm going to say a few things, but I also want to remind you that there are cards that you might have brought in with you. If you have questions, we're going to have time for Q&A. Please pass the cards that you write your questions on to people in the aisle over here. They're waving their hands. This is such an amazingly rich discussion. My panelists know I will be publishing in October a book called Antisemitism and American Tradition. It's with a comma in the title, not a colon, because I didn't want an American tradition to get lost as a subtitle. And you've said things that have so resonated with me. First of all, Jason, the story about that cartoon, and how the anti-Zionism has been imported into the United States from the former Soviet Union is so powerful and so true. That cartoon was actually part of a special issue of SNCC magazine, which is not so easy to track down, but I was able to, where it was right after the Six-Day War, and the person who wrote the article had a list of all of the crimes of Israel that Israel had committed as a result of its founding and then as a result of the Six-Day War. So you kind of stole some of my thunder from that chapter, but I'm still hoping people will read the book. But Stephen said something really powerful about that what makes the news, what ends up in social media, are these viral moments that the news is glomming onto, and I literally said this in Congress in an earlier hearing, because that's what they're interested in, but they don't pay attention to everything else that is going on, and so it makes the campuses really look like these horrible hotbeds of anti-Semitism, when if you go into the university hospital, you're not going to be seeing that. And then to react to Nick, that these reports are amazingly valuable resources, not only for today, but for the historians. And they are hundreds and hundreds of pages, because Harvard's is 300 pages. I forgot how many. You're having 4. And I read Stanford's, which was a couple of hundred pages. And these are pulling together data that we're going to keep in the Center for Jewish History and will give us the context for writing about this moment of anti-Semitism in American life far into the future. So before I turn to the questions, do you want to respond to each other? Thank you.
I want to, first, it was just extremely moving what you were saying about your kids. I want to highlight one other area we haven't talked about, which I think illustrates a lot of this, and also the limits of some of the kind of discipline-first approaches. And I want to share a story about one of these Jewish kids who's at Harvard right now. My friends on the medical faculty at Harvard 3 years ago started to notice that there are very, very few Jews in the incoming classes. Like, our estimate is about 5 out of 165 in the first year class, which is a drop of something like 75%. So it's interesting to note that 5 years ago, Harvard Medical School changed its mission statement. And I will read you a section of the old mission statement and a section of the new mission statement. The old mission statement, the heart of it was, Harvard Medical School is a diverse community of the best people committed to leadership in alleviating human suffering caused by disease. The new one reads, Harvard Medical School is a diverse, inclusive community dedicated to alleviating suffering, improving health and well-being for all. So first of all, not just suffering from disease, and second, the best people is gone. Now there's a lot of smoke there, and there's probably some fire. And I want to point out that actually the most significant factor, and if you look at the Harvard Crimson, it's not great social science methodology, the religious breakdown of incoming classes, and from the class of 2018 and prior, the number of Jews was in the, self-reported Jews was in the low double digits. We know that's a strict undercount because atheist and agnostic were also options, and it was choose one radio buttons. So you're talking probably 12, 14, 15%. We think it was 17% when I was an undergrad, I had a class of 04. And that percentage drops by basically 50% for the class of 2019 and never recovers. Right? That is much too fast. This isn't the Mark Oppenheimer, we're one generation further away from the tiger moms and regressing to the mean, et cetera. This is something else. And we have these data, again, this is broadly like the dots up there for Hillel International has the data from the Jewish day school high schools. And over the course of basically 7 years, the number of admitted Jewish kids drops by 60% to the Ivy Plus schools, even as the number of applications increases slightly. And so I want to point out that actually for the experience of any given Jewish person, the Jewish student, actually like the vibrancy and size of the Jewish community probably matters more, at least as much as any of these other things, and is the kind of thing that is happening right behind the scenes. It's not newsy, it's not viral. The second thing I want to point out, and this is the moment of heroism, there's an Israeli student, Kim Nahari. She was the chief of staff of her special forces unit in his IDF before coming. And she said to me, this was past fall, she said, it will not be easy to be an Israeli at Harvard College this fall. But it's nowhere near as hard as what my friends are being asked to do in Gaza. And this is the front I was deployed to for the Jewish people in Israel. Right, there's applause, right? She deserves that. What an honor to be in a community with people like that. And there's echoes, right, of Zelensky's line to Biden, like, I don't need a ride to the airport, I need ammo. And I think, in terms of being careful what we wish for, I think we should think about what theories of Jewish students are implicit in some of our concern. Like, we ought to be outraged at all the things that have been described. And it's not entirely clear to me that that cashes out in harm to Jewish students. There's actually a heroism. And we see this from students like Alicia Baker at Columbia. And I'll just share one more story in this vein. A student who was very interesting, complicated Jewish identity, really thoughtful, and came into Yale as an anti-Zionist. Because in his account, he went to a pluralistic Jewish day school, which was pluralistic about everything except Israel. Or if you said the word Zionism, you would be yelled at by the teachers and shamed. And he said to me, it was really amazing, there was an encampment up at Yale for a couple weeks last year, he said, I don't understand why this is, but every time I walk past that encampment, the only thought that pops into my head is that all of my favorite Yiddish writers, even though they were very serious socialists, were murdered by the Bolsheviks in the Gulag. And then towards the end of the time when the encampment was on Beinecke Plaza, when it started to get rowdy one Saturday night, he looked me in the eyes and said, now I've seen a mob. And 2 weeks later, when the encampment was yet more radical, he said to the head of J Street Yale, he said, Noah, we need to realize, they were right when they told us that every leftist movement ultimately turns on its Jews. So I want you, as you think, well, and you see this, I could share many, some data and some anecdata on this, but what I want you to think about is that the experience of young people on campus right now is, they're being discriminated against, and Jewish students, sympathetic conservative students, some Christians, and that it's way too early to tell what that will mean for the course of their generation, their adult lives. But one thing I think is safe to say is that they are not impressed with what they've seen in the encampments. They're often not swayed by it. In fact, I would say the most common reaction is to be repelled by it. And we should have some measure of trust in the kids that we've worked so hard to raise and their ability to prevail against this challenge as well.
Stephen, Nick, want to respond to each other? Stephen?
Yeah. I'll tell a story of, I've taught introductory psychology for 30 years, first at MIT, then at Harvard. One of the staples in the undergraduate psychology curriculum is evidence that if you divide people into groups, they immediately distrust each other. And to illustrate it, I use a lot of songs, cartoons, jokes in my lectures. So I play the classic song by Tom Lehrer, National Brotherhood Week. And you all know the final stanza. Oh, the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. So when I play that song, year after year, and you know that when you're kind of an amateur comedian, you know what the laugh lines are, when to expect laughter. And reliably, year after year, the class would burst out into hysterical laughter when they heard that line. Except 2 years ago, deadly silence. Now, I think it's a combination of factors. One of them is that there's the feeling that racism has to be approached with such awe and dread that you may not laugh about it. But I think part of it is that the Harvard student body Harvard has become more Goyish. The number, I even just did an informal survey of Jewish surnames in my course rosters, and it has gone down by about half. There are a number of reasons for that, and I've looked into it. I've consulted with Leonard Sachs at Brandeis, who has the best data on it. Part of it is as the number of non-whites on campus has gone up, the number of Jews has gone down, and there may be a reason to think that Jews are always about 25% of the white student body. Part of that is affirmative action. Part of that is the huge number of Asian American students that is applied. The economist Carolyn Hawksby has shown that one of the reasons that elite universities have become so much more selective is that what used to be regional markets for universities, people wouldn't go more than a couple of hundred miles from their homes. Now it's a nationwide market. And so the smartest students in California will apply to Harvard. So we have many more talented students other than those from the Northeast, and therefore a lot more, for example, talented Asian American students. And part of it is, I think, some selection for activism. We don't know because our admissions office is so, guards their formula so tightly, the holistic admissions, recently blown up by the Supreme Court, probably a good thing. And the anti-Semitism report notes that far too many 17-year-olds are accepted on the basis of a record of social activism, giving them the message that their political opinions are already formed and they have a mandate to act on them on campus. Recommended, I think, quite wisely that we start to select students who show some open-mindedness, some willingness to learn once they arrive on campus and aren't being selected for their activism before they even walk in the door. Whether there is some regression to the mean, fewer ambitious Jewish tiger moms, I don't know. Probably the other demographic changes like the nationwide market and the declining non-white admissions might account for all of it.
Nick.
Well, let's see. First of all, I want to push back a little, Jason, on the idea that you can really attribute anti-Semitism to the left, full stop. I'm old enough to remember when Jews weren't allowed to be in the final clubs at Harvard, and it wasn't because we were Zionists. It was because we were pushy and vulgar, and we talked about money and blah, 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 blah. There were all these other reasons. There's always some reason, to exclude Jews, and also even more pernicious, I think, in campus. And, I love Lishi Baker, who you mentioned. Not everybody is Lishi Baker. He's a very courageous kid. You may not know, his grandfather was the dean of the public health school at Columbia for many years, and a great dean, and he died of ALS. And he was being wheeled into the office on a gurney for 2 years because he just wouldn't give in. Lishi has some of that. But for a lot of kids, who don't have that kind of character, this constant scapegoating of Zionists, whatever that means, and this division of, the world into good Jews and bad Jews is really, really pernicious. And I hope it can be stopped. It should be stopped. I want to say a couple more quick things about a subject nobody wants to hear about, but I'm a veteran university administrator, so some of the reason for what's going on at Columbia is administrative. Hate to say something that boring, but we've had 4 presidents in 22 months. So our leadership who recently has been virtually all people who are brand new on the job and don't know the university community very well. Two other things that help explain Columbia. There's the famous, legacy of Edward Said. So we've talked about that. We all know that. Both are a result of 1968, sort of obliquely at least. One, we don't have a campus police force. We have a campus security force that up until very recently had a rule that they were never allowed to touch anyone for any reason. That creates a situation where if somebody needs to be touched, like an encampment or a building takeover, you have to call the New York Police Department, which is seen as, super trafe in the Columbia community. So that's a real problem. And the other is that we have two bodies, the University Senate and the administration, that both assert authority over the same thing, which is who sets the rules for student protests and who enforces them. And that's still not completely resolved. And that makes life very confusing if protests are front and center.
So this is a perfect segue to one of the questions. It's a question I've been asked, so I'll answer it first, but I want to hear your answers. What would you do if you were the president of your university? My answer, I would never want to be a president of any university. And I've been asked it, but I'm really curious about yours. What would you do? What would be the one thing you think you could do on your campus if you were the president? What would you do? Nick? Steve?
I've already answered it. That is to articulate and defend principles, starting with that the goal of the university is to discover and transmit knowledge, but just to have principles that you can defend and act on them and defend them.
Okay.
I'm going to yes and that and kind of tack in an administrative direction. So one piece of context here, something that's been like, this is kind of underneath the astronomy contrast, is you kind of start to realize that the heart and soul, or maybe the keystone of academic freedom is not an individual scholar's capacity to say or write whatever he or she thinks, without consequence. It's a department's sovereignty in determining what's good work in that field, right? No one gets to overrule the econ department and say, like, that's not good economics, right? Or the neuropsych department or whatever. And the problem we're having is that some departments have abused that power. And that's what leads to the federal government's demand at Columbia for receivership of the department, to install someone from the outside, basically as a kind of break-in. Now, it turns out there is a lever of accountability internally, which you intuited when we met a couple weeks ago, and is in the Harvard Task Force report, and President Garber is live to, which is the role of a visiting committee. Every 3 years, the overseers at Harvard, which is a word we still keep, it hasn't been purged like masters, appoint different outside scholars to come and audit the departments at Harvard. Now, there's a lot of, as you put it, regulatory capture. These might be people you presented with at a conference. You might go out to dinner. They end up kind of shilling for the department, say, oh, you need more grad student lines and more administrative support, et cetera. But if you picked the right visiting committee, you would have a kind of internally, academically constituted way of critiquing your own programs. And to give you a picture of how that looks and feels right at Harvard, in the last fall, a year and a half ago, there was one of these, petitions signed by over 122 faculty about the university's complicity in genocide, et cetera, et cetera. Of the 42 departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, 39 had 0 faculty on the petition, and it was about half of English, history, and African American studies. So you might think, wow, maybe I'll have someone from the history department of Tel Aviv University lead the visiting committee at Harvard. And I think those are the types of things one could imagine. I'm saying this particularly at Harvard because that's President Garber's style, is not to kind of draw a line in the sand, but to work through mechanisms like that. And I think if you signaled that you were going to do that, you wouldn't even have to wait 3 years for results.
Nick.
I have a different solution to the same problem that will be revealed in a couple weeks in one of our reports, so stay tuned. But I would say, and this may be impossible, I know, but there's a real problem of what I would call the blind man and the elephant issue at universities, which is, you're the president of the university, so you happen to know that the alumni's view of what the university basically is has almost no overlap with what the faculty's view is and the student's view has no overlap with those views. And I mean, let's leave aside the fabled Zio donors. I mean, the parents, everybody thinks they're dealing with a different entity, the sports fans. So as the president, you go around and speak to each group, you know what they want to hear, and you don't try to sell them on an overall set of principles that everybody should agree on. It would be great for a president to be able to do that. Yet another example of this is the relationship with the federal government, which Trump is, exploiting. But, it's the same idea of just being overconfident that very little understanding of the internal values and operations of a university is dangerous if you're 30–40% dependent on the federal government and they don't get you at all. So I would try to create a lot more of a shared understanding and shared rhetoric among all these different groups. I mean, for a tiny example, I've never met a single person who isn't a tenured faculty member who believes there should be tenure, and I am a tenured faculty member. So there's lots of things like that where, you have this big entity that needs a lot of participation from a lot of different people, and they just don't think they have hold of the same thing.
Right. So interesting. So I'm curious, and some of the questions have asked about this. So we were asking in this panel, are Harvard and Columbia the exception or the rule? Your take, the exception or the rule? Nick, why don't we start with you?
More the exception. I liked your chart, partly because I am the current chair of the board of the Washington Monthly, so I liked this shout out. But yeah, it's very, I think in addition to the elites, I suspect like some of the Cal State campuses, you might find a lot of this. But it's definitely not systemic through higher ed. Remember there's 3,500 degree granting higher ed institutions in America, 2,500 grant the bachelor's degree. Almost all of them are open admissions and only treat a geographically local population. Almost all of them are just training people straight up to enter the job market, and that's the vibe. And it's not throughout all of higher ed. And what I said before about the parts of higher ed where this lives, the anthropology department, et cetera, are shrinking.
Right. And remember, only about 10% of the Jewish college students are in the elite universities. Most of them are either in these other private universities or at state universities. Yeah. Jason? Steve?
I'm tempted to recall the joke where Stanley Goldfarb dies and the rabbi gives a kind of a pro forma eulogy, not knowing much about him. Then it comes time to say, well, does anyone in the congregation like to share some of their warm memories of the dear departed Stanley? And there's a silence, and silence continues, and the rabbi says, well, surely someone has something nice to say? And a voice from the back says, his brother was worse. So,
I think that's a perfect place to end this panel. Thank you so much.